Hi, welcome to our CTO Ask Me Anything forum. This event today is focused on serving first-time CTOs, those early in their CTO journey, and leaders aspiring to becoming a CTO. I'm Doug Cavanis. I'm DevPro's Chief Sales and Marketing Officer, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event. I'm joined by Scott Mitchell, the former CTO of Salesloft, and over 7.5 years from 2016 to 2024, Scott helped transform and scale Salesloft from a startup doing just $7 million in revenue to a $180 million company, and then all the way through to the acquisition by Vista Equity Partners. Also, DevPro is pleased to have had the opportunity to build the mobile app for Salesloft. So a little bit about Scott. He's based in Atlanta and today enjoys advising SaaS startups and coaching first-time CTOs. Scott is also an advisor at Atlanta Tech Village. Previously, Scott was the lead architect responsible for the Silverpop platform, which was acquired by IBM in 2014 and became the IBM Marketing Cloud. Personal tidbit about Scott: when he's not working or on some sort of outdoor adventure with his wife, you can probably find Scott out at the golf course working on his game. In fact, he mentioned he's got, I think, a 72-hour or 72-hole 3-day tournament coming up with some friends in the next days. So today we're scheduled to run until 7:45 p.m. Eastern, but Scott and I are happy to stay through 8 p.m. for anyone who would like to continue the discussion. And for those who are not familiar with DevPro already, we're a 1,000-person software development company that helps tech-driven businesses scale their engineering resources quickly and cost-effectively. Clients and companies we have served include companies like Global Payments, Heartland, Securrency, Zealous, and a large coffee chain based on the West Coast. Most of our team is based in Latin America and Europe to provide nearshore and offshore support. And we regularly put on CTO dinners and other events in cities throughout the USA and Europe in which we bring tech leaders together to exchange insights and make new connections. Today, this community that you're part of now includes more than 1,000 tech leaders. So a few housekeeping items. One is event guidelines are posted in the chat. So we request you can request to open your mic before speaking. You're welcome to use the chat to let us know if you have a comment or question you'd like to share. And then feel free to drop your questions for Scott Mitchell in the Q&A box, which you'll see on the right-hand navigation for the screen at any time. It helps us shape the conversation around what topics matter the most to each of you. And then Scott's LinkedIn profile will be pasted in the chat as well. And you're welcome to connect with him and also learn more about his work from visiting that. And then we will be recording today's event, and you'll be able to access this recording by this Friday in case you'd like to revisit the conversation or share it with others. To support you as a community of peers, tomorrow we'll plan to share your LinkedIn profile and email address with your fellow participants in today's discussion. Let us know, please, if you prefer to opt out of this. So those are all my opening comments. Now, Scott, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. Good to see everybody. Looking forward to the conversation today. I thought just to give a little more color, obviously, Doug, you shared a good bit of the background. I thought I'd add in a few kind of details just to give people a little more context of kind of where I'm coming from. For the last 20 years, I've spent my time inside of SaaS startups. Obviously, there's more time prior to that that's less relevant, but consulting and IT and some custom app development. But over the last 20 years, 3 different startups, and I sort of commonly say the third time makes the pattern, right? Salesloft was the third time joining a startup, and it's very similar stage. 80 to 90 employees, product market fit has been attained already, and the company is at that stage where it's time to scale. And so the first one was a small company called Servidyne that certainly nobody has ever heard of. I would say the good news is each of these went better as we got more things figured out, as I wound up in companies that had better product market fit. But that first application at Servidyne was a mobile work order management system for large building infrastructure. It was cool because we were doing mobile before mobile was much of a thing. We had a web app and a BlackBerry mobile app that all the maintenance crew would use to actually manage their work orders and complete their work. After a few years there, I moved over to Silverpop, which you referenced, which was marketing automation, marketing email, and that was really my first taste of scale, right? Both in terms of organizationally and platform infrastructure. We were sending by the time of midway through that IBM acquisition, Black Friday emails were going out at the rate of 2 to 300 million a day. By the end there, about 400 million a day. And that IBM Marketing Cloud team, that we were acquired in to create, kind of be the hub of that IBM Marketing Cloud, expanded to about 14 teams globally, with a handful of startups that were all part of that acquisition mode that IBM was in, creating the Marketing Cloud. And then finally moving over to Salesloft, again, to join around that same stage, right? 7 million in revenues you already referenced. The dev team was kind of 2.5 Scrum teams at that point, and that scaled to, I guess, when I handed engineering off to our chief product officer a year or so before I left, around 150 engineers. And yeah, so that scaled more rapidly than any of them, and was a ton of fun. For those who aren't familiar, Salesloft is a player in the sales engagement space. So think of, if CRM is sort of the management system of record for customer interaction, sales engagement is the platform in which sellers actually do their work, right? And maintain those customer relationships, manage their prospects, manage their opportunities, coordinate and record and analyze the meetings they're having. But basically anything we could do to give the tools to the seller to be have more effective engagements with their customers and prospects. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. Looking forward to kind of where we go with the conversations. Happy to try to help people understand sort of the journey of the CTO, and it's obviously a job that changes very much with stage and scale of the company. They're very different role depending on what we're talking about there. So where do you want to start, Doug?
Well, Scott, I appreciate those opening remarks. I think one thing I'd be curious about to ask for the group is, like, what were you not prepared for? Like, you've managed fairly complex scale technologies, but now you're actually the CTO for a company and leading their development. What were you not prepared for when you stepped in?
Yeah. So I did not join Salesloft as CTO. That's probably some good context. I joined as chief architect. And I had been fairly clear during the process that I was a high-level IC. I didn't manage teams, and that lasted about 5 months. If anybody knows the founders of Salesloft, you'll know that they are very convincing people, and they talked me into, no, I think the right thing at this stage of your career is to go and take that plunge. And so I don't know about, like, what I wasn't prepared for. I mean, I knew I wasn't prepared, right? I was going out on a limb, doing something I had experimented once before and had not been ready for, and that was 7 or 8 years prior. So at this point, I knew I was kind of consciously taking a step into the unknown, right? Most good learning happens right at that edge of your comfort zone. So I was ready for some really good learning, but at that point, it became clear that I needed to shift my focus from everything I'd ever done, right, was focused on how do we take technology and apply this to business problems, and what are the new technologies? Instead, all my personal development, professional development, had been pivoted, right? And I had to really start consciously learning, what does it mean to properly build a team and lead them in the right direction and give people what they needed to be successful. So it was a ton of work.
Wow. And in your experience, what should a first-time CTO focus on in their first 90 days when they step into the role? Any thoughts on that?
Sure, and that's somewhat stage dependent, but in a lot of ways, that beginning step is not, right. That first 90 days is exploring and learning, listening, right, not jumping in with assumptions, right. I'm sure we've all had that experience with somebody we jokingly called a new guy syndrome, right, where The whole exercise seems to be to judge all the decisions of the past, maybe somewhat harshly. And so in that first 90 days, I think it's really about talking to everybody, right? Your executive peers, understanding what that team is and what the challenges are within the business, the people within engineering, DevOps, whatever your span of control is, to understand who they are, to understand what the capabilities of the product that you already are stepping into that already exists, how it's positioned, what its strengths are, what are its gaps, what are the challenges. Um, for example, in that sort of exploratory stage at Salesloft, it became really clear what the highest priority project was going to be. Right, we had a scaling issue that we had a clock ticking that basically we had a 1 year timeline, and so in that sort of first, in that case, probably 30 to 45 days, finding out that what's that landscape and not judging, just collecting, right? And
Mm.
so that then you've got the full picture so you can sort of set the agenda to go forward with.
Thank you, Scott. And I'm going to encourage our participants to maybe, if they have questions, to go ahead and maybe post those in the Q&A section. I do have some other questions that I think might be of universally relevant for folks. One that I'm really interested in, Scott, is what frameworks or decision-making models have helped you as a CTO align engineering priorities with broader business growth objectives, especially when navigating kind of that dynamic tension between speed, scale, and sustainability?
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's a lot in that question. First and foremost, I'm a fan of the OKR system. We used it heavily at Salesloft. That's not obviously a product specific framework by any stretch, but what it did do is um, it's very effective at providing alignment across the entire company, right? We could set those high level company goals, and then everybody else could slot in through there and show how we were supporting the objectives at the company level, then at the department level, then inside the department, how people were helping move either the department's goals or other departments' goals forward. I think the real question behind the question there feels like it relates to tech debt and architectural or engineering based projects.
Yeah.
That's more complicated, right? It's nuance. It's also somewhat stage dependent. I like to say that essentially there are seasons for that, right? There are seasons where you're incurring debt, and there are seasons when you're paying it down. The big thing there is to know what season you're in and be honest about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are times where the priority is we've got to build, we've got to build, we've got to build. I mean, say we're catching up in a competitive environment, let's say, and being clear with the engineering team that that's where we are and that we ought to be very good at cataloging the debt that we're incurring, right? Making sure we know what that is, making sure that architectural projects are getting laid out. And then when we have the opportunity, and that's part of leadership's role, is to fight for those priorities, right? And making sure that we're being clear when we're making that change from nowhere it's time to pay down some of that debt, is that we already have a backlog curated and know what are our highest priorities. Now, the framework question there is interesting in that I've used a system that's actually put together by another guy in Atlanta named Jason Brett, who's a product leader, but he's got a framework called the 60-second business case that I've always found to be super helpful, mostly because it's very simple. And basically, it allows you to define 4, 5, 6 attributes that you're scoring against, and kind of put some science against that behind that prioritization, so that once you have your backlog, you really can keep it properly prioritized, so that the biggest things are right there at the top. And when you get your opportunity to have those planning meetings, you can inject in the most important things into the discussion.
Great.
And this is one, Doug, where and folks in the audience, in the chat, would be super interesting to also hear kind of what other people are seeing in that way, right? This is a good sort of collective topic. Everybody has this sort of challenge.
I was going to say, in startups and software companies I've worked in over the years, technical debt management was definitely one of the greatest tensions while you're trying to innovate at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think that's great that you had a very open and honest, like trying to recognize I think some organizations kind of hide it, or they don't articulate it fully. And I totally agree. Articulating it so key decision makers and stakeholders kind of can share that information.
Yeah, and it was helpful. So, by the way, I'm not going to say we had it solved or that it was uh, all wonderful and happy, right? But being clear on the fact that, yep, we're moving fast, so we're dedicating a higher percentage of our capacity to new features right now, making sure that it was clear to leadership and the rest of my peers that that's not how we can do this sustainably, right? That there will be seasons where we need to pull back and invest more time in non-functional, if you will, development.
Right. Maybe to ask you about engineering culture, what would be some early signals or signs of a healthy engineering culture? And then what are some red flags that a new CTO might need to watch out for?
Yeah, for me, that question always in my brain immediately brings up the concept of ownership. And so, in a healthy environment, I want to have helped create an environment, right, where people feel ownership of the code of the applications they're building, or the functionality they're responsible for.
Mhm.
I think without that concept and without that feeling of ownership, uh, code doesn't get better, right? It gets worse. It falls into the tragedy of common. So if you're feeling like that might not be there, right? The symptoms I've always seen is you kind of get a victim mentality, right? People feel like they're having things done to them that people aren't. There's not that recognition that they're part of the solution. That somebody else, they need somebody else to fix something, right? So a bit of a victim mentality. And so pivoting that and making it clear that, look, none of this is getting better magically, right? We're the ones who are going to make it better. And so part of leadership's role is to make sure that their kind of span of control or their area of responsibility is clear. But also then once that's been made clear, making it clear that nobody else, there's no knight on a silver horse riding in to save the day, right? If it's going to get better, you're going to make it better. And so
Yep.
removing that kind of victim mindset and sort of empowering them to say, no, let's be clear on what's important. How do you raise issues that you're seeing? How do you go on and proactively knock those out? Doug, it would be super interesting to me if possible. I know we talked about maybe doing some polls. It'd be great to know kind of, uh, kind of the size of people on the call, what sort of the size of engineering teams people are seeing and working with. It'd be helpful to understand the stage there. Is that something we could do?
That sounds great. Joan, if you could maybe post a poll for the group on that, that would be great. And while you're doing that, I'll maybe, Scott, I'll ask you another question or two here. So many first-time CTOs obviously come from strong technical backgrounds. Maybe they've been coders themselves or an architect, but
Sure.
what mindset shifts do you think are essential for somebody stepping from that role into executive leadership?
Yeah. There's a lot there. Again, a bit stage dependent, but let's assume we're kind of in that world where, again, you've already got product. You're starting to, usually where the tension starts to happen or where people kind of get out of their initial comfort zone is when they're really having to scale up a team. And so getting intentional about what it means to build the team, right? What skills do we need? What roles do we need? That's a continual evaluation, right? As you grow, as you get more budget, as you have more capacity. But also being able to then, with your executive peers, help them understand what you do, but in a business context, right? Everybody else in that executive team is a business person, right? And we're the technologists stepping in and being asked to learn how to act like a business person. And so, talking about pull requests, talking about continuous deployment pipelines isn't what they're listening for. And so, kind of reorienting your language to kind of help put things in terms of timelines, in terms of costs, in terms of business impact becomes critical in those conversations with the executives or with the other, or the next level up with the board itself.
Great. Let me just share for our participants that if you're looking for where the poll is, if on the right-hand navigation, you'll see a little chart. It's kind of in the middle on the right-hand side. And if you click that, you'll be able to toggle between the different choices that are offered, starting with teams of 1 to 10, 11 to 30, 31 to 50, and 51 plus. So Scott, I think we're still getting some votes in there.
There. I see Philippe
So,
has submitted a question. Okay, if I tackle that one?
yeah, please.
Awesome. So let's see, just to read it out in case not everybody's seen it. Whenever you need to hire a new team, regardless of whether you hire them or do outsourcing, what are the best things that would convince you in order to make a decision to hire? Obviously, that's pretty multifaceted. I think the biggest thing for me that I'm kind of priority wise is that capacity to learn and that eagerness to kind of take the initiative, right? And those two are sort of related. But I'm less worried about do they know every specific of the actual technical stack we're working in, right? Those things can be learned. I want them to have a good background. I want them to have a diverse background where possible in terms of tech stacks. But having demonstrated that ability to take something new and learn it and master it is the biggest priority for me. And then kind of culturally, like I said, somebody who's interested in then owning, right, the thing that they're going to build, feeling like they're responsible and accountable for producing high quality product.
Thank you for that question. And then, Scott, I'm looking at the poll, and right now I see there's one person who voted that they have one to 10 people in an engineering team.
Mm-hmm.
One voted 31 to 50, and then two said 51 plus. So we have quite a variety there.
Yeah. Yeah. That 51 plus could be a very big range. That's interesting. And that 31 to 50 is a really fun time. Kind of backing up to that question about kind of initial kind of skills to get built and such and focuses. That 31 to 50 is a really good example of kind of org design becomes a skill you have to navigate as well, right? What does it mean as that team grows? How do you segment it properly? How do you get things built out so that people still have that feeling of community and small team environment, even though the organization itself is getting complex?
Right.
Cool.
Scott, I'm curious, like, what would be a mistake or a failure you made in your first year that when you reflect, or maybe just you weren't armed with the right information, would there be anything that you kind of learned
Mm,
from?
so many things. Um, I guess one's just sort of an amusing story, and the other is probably more serious. The the more serious one, again, management is a very different thing, right? You come from a world where everything is cut and dry and binary. The tests either pass or they don't pass. The app is either up or it's down, although they can be nuanced. But I think my biggest kind of leadership slash management mistake was not trusting my instincts, kind of back to that hiring question. I was asked to take on a very senior leader um, that was already well known to the organization. And so it wasn't so much a, hey, interview this person and if you like them, hire them. Uh, and I kind of had warning, yellow flags going off in my brain as I got to know this person during the kind of evaluation stage. But I didn't have the confidence to say no. Um, and so I did bring this person in, had them in my organization, struggled culturally with this person for 2 years before we finally agreed before I finally put my foot down and said we need to make a change. And so I didn't do that fast enough, right? I should have done it at the very beginning, but I didn't trust my instincts. I then wanted to make it work, and it was detrimental to the team overall until I
Hmm.
finally, a very unique situation, but I waited way too long to resolve it, right? And so that's just uh, lack of experience on how important that is, right? Because the whole time that person is just a stone in the organization's shoe, right? Just rubbing and rubbing and irritating and just super toxic for an environment that had been very, very well aligned. Um, the other one I'll probably save for another time, but yeah, we had a very major technical project that, gee, if it had just finished in 12 months instead of 13 months, would have been so much better. But if we have time later, I can share that one.
Um, So Scotty, maybe I'm going to shift gears to a little bit about what you're finding in your coaching practice as helping other CTOs. Are there common challenges you find your clients typically face that are almost can be expected, or is it like very
Sure.
heterogeneous in terms of what people are dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, not everything's the same, but there's a really common pattern, right? Most of the folks I've met are either technical co-founders or kind of first engineer on the team who have grown into that role of CTO and been promoted into it. And so initially, right, the phases of the CTO role as a start in a startup are pretty distinct, right? And that initial CTO role is, lead dev, senior engineer, right? Primary code contributor. And so the transition uh, as the team grows, as the complexity amps up, of when essentially to stop coding is the ultimate question. But it's this spectrum, right? And
Mhm.
so most of us are wired to continue to want to or find our kind of satisfaction from still building new capabilities, contributing to the code base, helping the
Yeah.
team across the finish line, and finding ways to transition that, or maybe there's still an opportunity or an avenue for you to still kind of meet that sort of personal need, but not do it in a way that robs the team of ownership, right? And so being the, that's the common pattern I see is like not giving enough ownership to the team, not giving enough freedom to the team, right? It doesn't always, there's a point at which it's no longer your solution, right? You have input, you provide guidance, but the team needs to come up with the solutions themselves. And so finding that tipping point, right, where that happens, some of that is also about getting the right skills to hire and frankly fire, right? So that you get people that are capable of doing that, right? And not requiring the CTO to run the show from that level of detail, at that level of detail.
And Scott, we have a new question. I'll let you read that if you want.
Sure. So some orgs are combining technology and product under a single CTPO. What are your thoughts on companies making this decision and the scope, responsibility of that combined role? Skylar, I've seen a little bit of that as well. My first reaction is, oh my gosh, that's big, right? Um, I've seen it as well where it's just frankly the CPO. It's splitting hairs as to what the title is, but I think the chief technology officer and chief product officer are such, generally speaking, different skill sets that it hurts my head when I see that together as one. I would argue that most technologists are not uh, great organizers, right? Great catalogers, great discoverers of customer problems and figuring out priority and all that sort of product management domain. And I don't think most product people are fantastic technologists. Can it happen? And is there the unicorn out there? Yes, absolutely. And at a certain scale, and I think that might be the bigger piece, at a certain scale, that person is very much more of an executive than they are either a product manager or a technologist. And what they're doing is really being that central choke point for a product leader and a technologist to then create product underneath them. And they're the arbiter of any sort of um, last line of defense sort of disputes and the overall setter of direction and budget and those sort of things. So I think at a certain scale, it becomes more tenable to me because that person is no longer kind of a domain expert of either side of the house, and they're hiring very senior people underneath them to deliver on that. But it's a big job. I believe it's a tough nut to crack. I'd be curious um, for others in the room if they have opinions on that. I think it's an interesting trend. I'd be curious if either if they're seeing that in their organization or if they've seen people really pull it off well.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see what the group says here because I've worked in a number of different companies, and it's rare, in my opinion, at least in small to mid-sized companies, where I've seen product and engineering be equal in power and influence. And
Mm-hmm.
often it's one dominates over the other. And it's not, and I find when it's most powerful, there's equal respect and value for the contributions of both. So I'm
Agreed.
curious what
Yeah.
our participants have seen. Any comments or observations, Skylar or others on that topic?
So it looks like, is it Charles who might actually have a question to share? Is that correct? Maybe not. Sorry, folks, we're kind of.
It looks like somebody's talking, but I see Charles talking, but I don't hear his voice.
We probably need to get him added to the stage. And sorry, folks,
There
we're
you
all
go. Hey,
experimenting with
Charles.
this software.
Is my microphone working now?
Now
Yes,
we hear
sir.
you.
Sorry, I ran a couple minutes late. I had the time written down wrong. I know in a company that I'm currently supporting as fractional, the product team requires a certain amount of technical knowledge in order to be able to comment on what the product actually can do without it being unreasonable. And so it's sort of an it depends situation. If the product team finds themselves with a relatively low level of tech knowledge compared to yourself, then they have to defer to you a little bit, because if they're asking for you to write an AI that can create a planet, it's like, well, it doesn't work that way, so I hope you didn't sell that. So there has to be at least some give and take depending on their own level of competency.
100%. And also, it's interesting you bring up something that just hit me in a whole different way, and outside of my experience. My experience has always been in business applications. I do wonder if that, CTP or CTP or CPT, I don't know sure which way people are ordering it, role in a dev tooling company or some other technical bit of software. I wonder if that becomes more attainable. You know what I mean? Where essentially, I imagine most of the product managers have a pretty solid technical background as well. But I totally agree with you. And in the case where it's a more traditional environment, yeah, the product managers and the engineering leaders need to be tied at the hip to be able to even validate product initiatives and their feasibility and scope. Yeah, so super interesting. I always enjoy. It's just been interesting over the years to watch how all of this evolves, right?
But Charles, I'll ask you a question if you don't mind.
Sure.
What's the most challenging thing about being a fractional CTO? Juggling priorities, emergencies?
Managing the expectations of the CEO.
Okay.
I'm right now fractional for a couple different companies, but one of them is doing an agentic AI that does fashion, that lives in the fashion space online. And the CEO knows next to nothing about tech. It's just, what if we did this, but it was fashion? It's like, that's a great idea. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're having to invent all these things from scratch, and she has no concept of the idea that there are sort of 6 interacting components that represent what she calls an AI that then, yeah, it means a lot to her whether or not the response calls something cute versus fabulous, because nobody would say that looks fabulous unless you're in a certain niche. You go into the store and they all say it looks cute. But
Right.
for her, that is the AI. She has no concept of the stuff that's having to happen underneath the hood to create the math to actually do this job well.
Right. It's funny, Charles, because I think what you just hit on is also super important in the full-time gig as well. I wonder if the challenge in particular in the fractional one is building the level of trust to be able to manage those expectations pretty well, right? Because you're just dropping in, nobody knows, brand new relationships, you're not there full time. You find it more challenging to kind of establish those kind of trust relationships with the other executive.
Oh, definitely, because there's an adjustment period while you figure out how each other works. Because before I was doing fractional, I was staff CTO for 14 years for the same company, and there'd be days where I just show up and play video games, and they know not to bother me because Charles is thinking. There's just there's something noodling, and they know I have to physically be in the space and listening to the chaos and responding to emails. But it's just This is thinking time. They know to give me those days sometimes.
Right.
So
totally.
I just wanted to go ahead.
Go ahead, Doug.
I just wanted to let everyone know that you're welcome as a participant to join the stage along with Scott and Charles. So if you would like to join this kind of more, like I'll say, discussion concept, feel free just to put a note in the chat so that our organizer knows to add you. So we'd welcome you being part of the discussion. And Maybe I'd be curious to ask both Scott and Charles while we're talking. I don't remember who asked, but they asked about the thought process as a CTO in terms of when you are dealing with sourcing, not just working with your own team of direct hires, but like when you're using an outsourcing provider or some other services provider. Are there other challenges or things to be aware of around that in terms of selecting a vendor and managing them along with your own team?
I guess I'll take my first pass at it, and then Charles would be curious yours, and obviously anybody else out there. Um, I know for me, I had struggled with outsourced engineering in my previous roles, and I felt like the thing that made it finally work for us at Salesloft was we had been doing too much. We had allowed the outsourcer to do too much, like period, right? They were doing the hiring. It was almost a black box, right? We had requirements, we sent them over the wall, that didn't come back right, we did it again, and there was too much thrashing, right? And so once we thought about it differently at Salesloft, we just made them different. They were just members of the team, whether they were full-time employees, whether they were outsourced, whether they were Salesloft employees in a different country. They were all just part of the same dev organization. I did try to follow the basic practice of teams were co-located by time zone, right? So we didn't have folks in Ukraine teamed with, folks in California just because of the time zone logistics. But being more kind of upfront and engaged in the hiring process through the outsourcer, and then just treating them very much, making sure they were culturally aligned and making sure they were treated just like all the other engineers, worked very well for us. Curious again, like Charles or anybody else on the call, what your experiences have been in that area as well, and what has worked well.
We find hiring to be kind of a significant problem. Part of it is what you were talking about of making sure teams are in the same time zone, or at least there's a good project manager who can keep everybody aligned. And I trust everybody to do their job well, but we had a recent person who wanted to outsource to the Philippines, and half the team was in South America. And I don't mind that, but I also don't necessarily want somebody working in the 1 to 5 a.m. time slot their own time, because I can set an alarm like anybody else can, but I don't think I'll be getting their best, most thoughtful work out of that time slot.
Right.
There's some time zone considerations and some project management considerations. I found that for me, the thing that makes the most successful is to break the project into sort of smaller chunks so that there's not any too much risk that is going down one path that's not necessarily tried and true when you're trying out a new vendor or trying out a new hire. Because the worst case scenario then is you've only lost 2 to 3 weeks on whatever that local sprint was, and you just never call them back and move on.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge that I've found was how do you get, in particular with outsourcing, right? How do you get a partner you can trust? And to your point, like finding a low risk, manageable scope project to sort of build on and see if, okay, is this going to work, right? Do I have the belief that they can deliver?
Right. At this point, you're going to see the math brain come out, because how much time does it take to develop trust? I don't know, a couple of months. What's the particular sprint we're working on? A couple of weeks? So how do you know they can do it? Well, you can't. It just doesn't work that way. You either call back the same team that you've already called, or you do some element of a faith exercise, or you have to have some kind of risk management in place. And I know a lot of the dev teams I work with basically want paid up front, and they want very clear checklists because they've worked with other companies in the past where the CEO is very unclear on what they want, or they have a non-technical person let's see. Let me back up a little bit. The speech I like to give is a lot of companies at some point, the person who's the head tech person who's fixed the printers the longest and fixed the website looks around and realizes, I'm the top ranking tech person here. I must be the CTO. And they assign themselves that title and put the hat on, and they're not necessarily wrong, but it also means the experience and the skill level varies wildly from CTO to CTO. And so sometimes these outsourced companies are calibrated to protect themselves against the lower levels of CTOs who don't really understand what they want or what they need and say, do this. And then they continually have scope creep, where they change their mind or they ask something unreasonable in the first place. And so I understand why the teams take the steps that they do for their own protection, because they end up being the ones getting blamed because the CTO is sitting here meeting with the other C levels and says they didn't deliver. And he's not wrong, they didn't, but there's the gap.
But the trust goes both ways, right? Both parties are trying to validate that there's an effective partner on the other side of this relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, and likewise, I've never had a remote team go poorly that had a proper project manager, because they're able to assign all the tasks in the Jira and keep everybody in line. And it's just that, that extra 10% for the project management really helps in my experience.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
The other thing we related to that we struggled with when the right time to do it was also when you make the outsourced teams cross-functional and kind of fully capable, right? And so we started with engineering, obviously, but had all the product managers, in this case, Atlanta-based. But then before very long, probably, I don't know, within that first year, went on and hired our first product manager that could start working with that team and sort of slowly built it out to where it really was fully capable. But again, to your point, Charles, that was done as we gained confidence that there was a match there, right? And that we were seeing success. And now it's like, how do we optimize that success? Because it would be great if they could get the product questions answered before, 4 p.m. their day, their daytime, when the East Coast comes online.
Well, thank you. So we have a question from Hisham. And maybe Scott, I'll ask you to address it first. I'm curious about software licensing. From your experience, does offering a licensed version of your product, of a product versus a subscription or open access, have a noticeable impact on sales performance or customer adoption?
I am going to have that unique opportunity to say, I don't know, right? I'm, I guess, lucky that all of my professional software experience has been SaaS. So we've been purely a subscription environment in all three of the companies I worked at. Having said that, there's all sorts of different pricing models around subscription, and the short answer with all my experience there is there isn't an empirical answer. It's an experimentation game, an A/B testing game to try to figure out how to maximize the value you get for your product from any particular customer segment. So I don't have licensed software experience, thankfully.
Charles, anything you want to add to that? Or?
I actually have better luck with just sucking it up and buying the license, because people, when you're pitching yourself, people ask things like, what project management software do you use? And the answer is saying something like Jira versus something like Ngia.ai that nobody's ever heard of. You need something in that moment that they've heard of, especially sitting across from a non-technical person, because you go Jira and they go, yes, I know that. Where's your cloud? Where do you do your hosting? AWS. Yes, I've heard of that. And then they move on. When you're answering something that is open source or something that is less well known, it becomes a stumbling block in pitching myself, I find. Because whoever I'm sitting across from who doesn't have the depth of knowledge of all the different things that do all the 100 different things, that understand that the Linux server I have sitting literally right here can do very, very well for a 0 to 1 MVP product. They don't know that. They want something they've heard of that they can then tell their friends about.
Yep, I'm not sure, Charles, I'm following it. I'm not sure. It might be great to get clarification from Hisham, but the idea of the product you're building, would you have more revenue generated if you had a subscription model versus kind of a perpetual licensing type of model?
Oh, you're right. I missed the point of the question.
Yeah,
it depends on the
such
level
a different world, right?
If you're pitching to VCs who want to talk billions, then they don't want B2C $2. They want something that's subscription. They want something B2B. They want something high dollar. They want something affiliate based. So it depends, and it depends on who your customer is. If you want to be
hey, Tom, did we answer your question, or would you like to any other angle on that you'd like to pose to them? Maybe while we're waiting for that, if it's okay with you, I'd like to shift gears to another question that I think might be relevant for the group, and that would be, when you thought about your early days as a CTO, to what extent did you or should you have relied on a peer group to be, or mentors, in terms of is that something both of you did actively, or is that something, I'm just curious what your experience and learnings around that are.
Charles, what's your experience? Then I'll time in mine.
I wish I would have done more, but quality mentorship is hard to find, because you go online and you Google or you go on LinkedIn, every response is somebody who wants to sell you something. Period. So for every company you've never heard of trying to certify you in order to be a better fractional CTO, those results and that return on investment in both time and dollars is unknown. And so I wish I would have sought out more mentorship. I wish I would have found good mentorship earlier on, but the quality is exceedingly low because they'd rather tell you something than actually mentor.
Yeah. For me, I think it's somewhat learning style dependent as well, right? I think some people, for me, it was huge. Two things. One, I had an executive coach that I worked with for most of my time at Salesloft, but that's helpful because my learning style, I learn best through conversation, right? Through having that back and forth with somebody. I might have homework to go do and go do some reading and such, but it really, for me, really gets solidified in my brain as I talk it through with somebody. And so the other thing that personally worked well for me, we have a couple of really good groups here in Atlanta, neither of which I organize, thank goodness, but get to be an active participant in. But also, every time we took a round of investment and brought a new investor to the table, I would usually reach out through our board member there to go find other portfolio companies in the family who were hopefully, X% ahead of us in their journey, and see if I could get a relationship with the CTO on that side and start having, conversations there. And I was happy to reciprocate with other companies that were earlier stage than us. And so that was sort of helpful to kind of build my own personal network of CTOs that I could lean on, that I could ask questions to when we were seeing something we hadn't seen before, or taking on a project we hadn't done before. It was super helpful.
Any other questions, anyone? And I know I think Hisham was trying to join the stage, but for some reason his settings were not allowing him to. But we'd love to hear any other questions or things that you might want to share. And I think we have a new.
Hisham may be coming to join us. And then he'll also tell us if we're getting things correct.
And I see Wayne Webb, but he's not on stage.
Can you hear me?
Now we hear you.
Yeah.
Hey,
yeah.
Hey, Wayne.
Come on board.
Yeah, thanks for pulling this session together. Scott, my question for you is having many career roles, how have you found the transition into, working for yourself in terms of like your coaching business? It's a different way to approach, sort of getting your skills out there and finding, people that want to buy them. So I'm curious about your journey there.
Yeah, appreciate that. First off, it is not something I ever envisioned doing. I've never worked for myself. And so, but genuinely, having done this sort of 3 times, I knew I didn't have it in me to try to do a 4th right now, and might not ever. And so it was time to try it. And man, I am not, Doug, there's a reason I am not in sales. I am appreciative of all the people who can do it. Glad that there are people who are wired that way, but I'm not. And I imagine most people in our domain are not. And so for me, the answer has been, it's a networking game. The good news is I know a lot of people, right? We were just saying, I've got a bunch of CTOs. I've got a bunch of executives. I know a bunch of investors. And so for me personally, the best path so far, and for everybody, whoever else is kind of going down that path, has actually been the investor side of things. And so getting some of the folks I know at VCs and growth capital organizations knowing that I'm doing this, and that they've probably got companies in their portfolio where they can see that risk, if you will, and have been willing to introduce me in to the CEO usually to have a conversation. Well, how well is it going, right? How's the team? Have they been effective? Are they keeping up? Is your CTO investing in his growth or her growth? That's so far been what's been working.
Yeah, no,
really?
Thank you. I think since transitioning into my own business myself, and to go to something that Charles was saying, I find most of the networking starts to focus on people that want to sell me something, not the other way around.
Yep. Well, like Charles was mentioning, most people who are reaching out have a reason they're reaching out, right?
Yeah.
So where it's reciprocal is best, right? But I don't know about you, but my experience at this point has not been has been that reaching out to CTOs for me isn't effective. Most CTOs, I don't think, are looking for a coach, are cognizant that it's a thing, that something that somebody would be willing to invest in. And so actually my luck has, like I said, actually been through engaging with the CEO and usually by being introduced by an investor who's got literally a vested interest. Doug?
Yeah, so we have a new question from Skylar I'll read. So, which I was hoping that we'd see an AI related question here. What parts of the CTO role are impacted by the advancement of AI? Which parts stay the same?
That's so broad. It's a super interesting time to be in business at all. Well, I guess it's a super interesting time to be a citizen of the world, period. It's true across all the CTOs I'm working with that they are in the midst of trying to answer this question and nobody has the full answer, right? We've been looking at it as we work through it through two lenses, right? What's AI's impact on your product, right? What do customers need? What does the evolution of this technology provide in terms of opening doors to maybe roadmap and backlog items that have just been unattainable until now, and trying to focus on those. And then the second is, how does it change how the team works, right? And so both are really starting to happen, right? I've got most of my customers have or are in the midst of introducing AI into their product for their customers to use, but also they are almost all either in a really significant pilot stage or have fully rolled out some sort of AI assisted development. And the path that has worked there is through some sort of highly curious engineer who kind of becomes the evangelist for it, right? Sort of builds community around how this works and what they're learning and how people can kind of get on board. Boy, what doesn't change? I mean, it's the same job for us still, right? Is how do we meet the customer's needs? What are those needs? What does that look like in terms of functionality? And we got to curate that, plan it, schedule it, deliver it, and and obviously as part of that, solve for it. Now we get more help or less depending on how it's playing out. Wayne, how have you experienced it?
Yeah, what I would say here, Scott, is finding with the rise of generative AI that there's just a whole bunch of new applications now for handling unstructured data.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's quite profound is that we had all of these branches of AI that have been around for years: computer vision, natural language processing, etc. It's all come full circle back to sort of the advent of foundational models. Now that they handle translation of ones and zeros from one language type to the other, and even new language types like how we encode DNA, how we encode a description,
protein engineering,
description of a molecule, right? So there's so many different applications here now where AI is just becoming embedded in all these real world applications. And I think what remains the same is there a lot of our processes need to be very rigid and predictable, and cost effective, right? AI is not always cost effective, so we still have all the same things that we used to do with structured data, all the same needs, and of course we have to create code for that. On the front end of that, ironically, is now sort of all of these coding tools that help people create processes to be able to handle structured data. So there's innovation happening everywhere at the moment. That's really interesting, but I think a lot of the underlying work still stays the same. I think one of the areas that impacts the CTO that they need to consider, though, is just the way that the value proposition is shifting upwards and across, and now technology is becoming democratized. So you see product people that are creating applications. You're seeing finance functions that are now getting a lot smarter. Forget the days of RPA. They're creating entire ways to talk to their Excel spreadsheets or systems or whatever. building that process automation with AI in a much more readable state than they have before. So, but having said that, I think some of the opportunities for junior developers are evaporating. Yeah, it's a concern I see, and one of the things I'm being mindful of in my business is to mentor and coach juniors so that they get the experience with the AI tools or the exposure needed.
I think we have a related question from Felipe, if I may. Felipe,
yeah, sure.
As a CTO, do you think it's better to invest in machine learning or deep learning? Additionally, would you fully trust an AI that performs the same work as a human developer? Would you like to?
I'm going to jump on that last statement right now and say no. I don't trust any AI. And I think that's a huge design decision, in particular, as you look at introducing AI into your product, right? Is you're now introducing non-determinism into your product, likely for the first time. And so how do you build for that, right? How do you keep the human in the loop? How do you gain their trust and confidence, right? Wayne, you referenced, right, that there have been many families of AI, around and being leveraged for ages, right? And I've sort of somewhat jokingly started calling it classical AI, right? Predictive analytics and that sort of thing. And IBM had a great example when we were there after the Silverpop acquisition of really great products that had a horrible time of building trust with customers, and they failed, right? Because nobody wants a black box that's just making magic decisions. This is still in that world, and maybe more so than ever, where this stuff works most of the time, but not all the time. And so keeping the human in the loop would be key to me. The question about deep learning versus, I don't remember the specific exactly, right? What was it? Machine learning or deep learning? I mean, I think deep learning is a form of machine learning. So I think that's a nuance and splitting of hairs. But I think right now, if you are dealing with unstructured data and language and the domains that LLMs are great at, I wouldn't be building a model at all unless I proved I needed to, right? I would be using somebody's off-the-shelf model. I would be, figuring out my prompting technique to get the answers from it I want. If I couldn't do that, I would fall back to fine-tuning, but I'm very unlikely to train my own model. Now, if you're doing something more in that classical space, right? I need a scoring algorithm for, success outcomes of some sort. Then I'm probably going to train a model off of data that I hold in my system.
I think you've just hit it. If I can pump in real fast. No, because you've absolutely just hit a home run with that statement. Building an AI for an AI's sake and then asking what can I do with it is approaching it backwards. You have a complex problem with huge ingestion sets of data, and then you build an AI to answer that problem. To say I have an AI, what can I do with it is in a way putting the cart before the horse.
Right. And that's where, again, this is just a new set of tools, right? To help us solve the same sort of problem we've always been asked to solve, which is I have a customer who has a need. And that is something I'm seeing because there's so much pressure, right? From boards, from investors, et cetera, to say, what's your AI story? And so they're like scrambling, like, we're going to put a chatbot in. Why?
Yep.
And so, great point, Charles, of reorienting always back to who's the customer, what are their problems? And all of us have backlogs that are super deep with things we knew we'd love to do, but we couldn't figure out how, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes these new technologies are unlocking that capability. So,
Scott, I really appreciate you being available today to provide all of your insights and your comments. I'm grateful for those that participated and had questions. Thank you for joining us. So we are at the end of our time, and I'll just share that in the chat, we'll be posting a link to our CTO dinner a sign-up page. And we, as I mentioned, we do about 70 to 80 of these a year in cities all across the US and Europe. And please, if you'd like to join us, let us know. You'll see that link in the chat. And yeah. Oh, and did we paste Scott Mitchell's LinkedIn profile as well? Just want to make sure we did that before people leave. So, and otherwise, that will be shared tomorrow, Scott. So, yeah.
No worries. And yes, Charles, it's going to be an interesting bit of slop that gets generated as well. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye.